alternatives. It was also promoted throughout the 1990s and 2000s in the so-called Washington Consensus that was promoted by U.S. Democratic President Bill Clinton and UK Labour leader Tony Blair. It was also heavily promoted over the course of really almost 4 decades by the powerful president of the Federal Reserve in the United States, Alan Greenspan, who served both Republican and Democratic presidents in the United States. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and I would argue right up to the global financial collapse of the last couple of years, there was a bipartisan consensus among economists and many political leaders on the virtues of deregulation as a way of stimulating markets, freeing markets, and generating global prosperity. The intellectual roots of this program can be found in the work of 2 key thinkers. One of them is the American economist Milton Friedman, who wrote in 1962 a key book that is often cited by American conservative thinkers called Capitalism and Freedom. The title of the book encapsulates the central argument that capitalism and freedom go hand in hand. That in fact, Friedman argues that all free societies have been capitalist societies and all capitalist societies have been free societies. Well, we know today that this argument is not, in fact, factually correct, but it's been a very, very powerful argument. Because Friedman's argument, which was an anti-Soviet and anti-communist argument, published at the coldest moment of the Cold War, right at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that if governments intervene in the marketplace to control economic activity, as communist governments did, the only way they could successfully control economic activity would be to control the activities of the people in those markets. So once you acknowledge the role or the need for government intervention in the marketplace, it's only a matter of time before governments begin to tell you where you can work, where you can live, what you can buy, what car you can drive, and then it's only a matter of time before the government starts telling you what you can say and what you can believe. So it's an argument about a slippery slope, and in the preface to Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman acknowledges his debt to the original slippery slope argument, which came from a book called The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944 by the Austrian economist who's considered one of the founders of modern neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was a passionate opponent not just of Soviet-style communism, but even of Western European social democracy, fearing that it would put us on the road to serfdom. Indeed, he was an opponent of the national health system in the United Kingdom, seeing that as a kind of creeping form of socialism that would ultimately lead to totalitarianism. So it's an anxiety born out of the history of fascism in Europe, born out of the history of the Cold War, and it's anxiety that leads these people to argue that any encroachment of the government on the marketplace, even for an ostensibly good cause like preventing pollution, is a cure that's worse than the disease. Now, this is the crucial argument then that we see emerging in environmental contrarianism. And in fact, we see the argument going even one step further. The argument that environmentalism is the slippery slope to socialism, communism, and tyranny. Why? Well, because most environmentalists, particularly in the 1980s, as issues like acid rain and global warming and the ozone hole were emerging, most environmentalists were indeed calling for government regulation. And so these men argued that from the regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it was only a small step towards government control of our lives, more generally. This argument can be found articulated in many contrarian, conservative, and right-wing journals and organizations, but it was articulated perhaps most explicitly by a 4th scientist who's part of our story and who joined the cause also in the 1980s. And that's a man by the name of S. Fred Singer, a name that is familiar to many climate scientists. Singer has probably been the most persistent voice in the United States, and here in Canada as well, attacking climate science over the last 20 years. Like the other 3, he was also a Cold War scientist. In fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. And like the other 3, he was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and the ozone hole. In fact, he wasn't a founder of the Marshall Institute, but very quickly he began to work with the other founders on all of these issues and became a co-author on many reports that they were writing. Now, I mentioned that Seitz had learned the tobacco strategy working for the R.J. Reynolds Corporation. That was from 1979 to 1985. In the early 1990s, we find Fred Singer working with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to attack the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the hazards of secondhand smoke. And I love this. There's a little little sideline on this about the Environmental Protection Agency. So here in the story, the tobacco industry makes an uncharacteristic tactical mistake. The tobacco industry thought about everything. They analyzed language, they analyzed dress, they thought hard about who their spokesman should be. They did focus groups and market research to figure out what messages would be most effective. And they decided they didn't like the phrase secondhand smoke because they reckoned that Americans didn't like secondhand things. So they did focus work, and they decided a better moniker was environmental tobacco smoke. But that sounded much more benign. But unfortunately, the term environmental tobacco smoke invited the scrutiny of the Environmental Protection Agency. So the Environmental Protection Agency began to look at the question of the environmental hazards of secondhand smoke in the environment. And in response, in 1993, Philip Morris funded Fred Singer and a lawyer by the name of Kent Jeffries, who worked for the Cato Institute, to write a report attacking the EPA over this issue. The report was called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. And here we need to do a little sideline into one additional important part of the story. So the money for this report came from the Tobacco Institute. That was an organization set up by the tobacco industry, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and others, ostensibly to do independent research on tobacco. But one of the things the tobacco industry did was to funnel money into think tanks that were supposedly independent, in this case a think tank by the name of the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute. And if you go on the webpage of the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute, you will of course find a homage to the great Alexis de Tocqueville, famous for the book Democracy in America. So the de Tocqueville Institute claims to be dedicated to promoting democracy and free market values. And of course, if we ask the question, who is Kent Jeffries, we find he was a lawyer affiliated with the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And again, both of these being dedicated to free market solutions to social problems. Cato Institute, by the way, was co-founded by David Koch. We've heard a lot in late about the Koch industries and all of their funding of the Tea Party in the United States. So what we begin to see emerging in the early 1990s is the story begins to get more complicated with the emergence of a whole network of think tanks, and Jim Hogan and Richard Littlemore have been tracking this and have written about this, a whole network, a kind of expanding or ramifying network of supposedly independent think tanks, but many of whom are actually funded by either the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, or other regulated industries like the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, etc. And these groups claim to be independent, but in fact, if you dig even one level below the surface, you find that they're not actually independent at all. All right, so what is going on here? So the EPA had studied the question of secondhand smoke. An independent peer-reviewed panel had reviewed thousands of scientific articles in epidemiology, oncology, and other areas looking at this question and concluded that secondhand smoke was indeed a Class A or proven carcinogen. This result was affirmed by the U.S. Surgeon General based on scientific studies published in the peer-reviewed journals in the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, Germany, and around the world. It was supported, as I said, by diverse independent peer-reviewed studies. So why would a rocket scientist challenge these data? Indeed, why would any scientist challenge these data? Well, the great thing about being a historian is you don't have to speculate, because it's amazing how many times people answer your own questions in their own words. So Fred Singer answered this question, and he wrote in this report on page 2, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much the government can ultimately control our lives. So there it is, the slippery slope to socialism, the road to serfdom. Today, secondhand smoke, tomorrow, the Bill of Rights. And we see this trope then coming up over and over and over again. Attacks on regulation is attacks on liberty, attacks on the free market, and fundamentally economically damaging. So Frederick Seitz made a similar point when he attacked the IPCC in the Wall Street Journal after the release of the second assessment report in 1996. IPCC reports are often called the consensus view. But if they lead to carbon taxes and restraints on economic growth, so there's the government interfering in the marketplace, they will have a major and almost certainly destructive impact on the economies of the world. Another little sideline here just to note, I often get asked about, well, how do we recognize this doubt-mongering kind of campaign? Well, one way you recognize it is here's a nuclear physicist making predictions about what's going to happen to the economy. I mean, he's not an expert on economic growth, right? And yet he's being cited as if he is. And Frank Luntz, my favorite, he made a similar point also in the Wall Street Journal when he attacked climate scientists in 2003 before his conversion. He wrote, "Once Republicans concede that greenhouse gases must be controlled, it will only be a matter of time before they end up endorsing more economically damaging regulation." And CBS News, just a few weeks ago, did a report when GOP presidential candidate Mitt Romney announced his presidency, his candidate for presidency. He was asked in Hanover, New Hampshire, where I used to live, by a software engineer, well, what's your position on the question of the reality of climate change? And Romney said that he accepted the scientific evidence that climate change was indeed occurring. He was immediately attacked by every single other Republican candidate running for office in the United States, running for the president, including by Newt Gingrich, who previously had said that he did accept the scientific evidence. And Newt Gingrich said, according to Reuters, that the push to address climate change is the newest excuse to take control of our lives by left-wing intellectuals. So throughout their writings, we see then these arguments being repeated. The assertion that environmentalists, and by implication scientists working on environmental issues, have a hidden agenda to control our lives. And that agenda is anti-business, anti-technology, and anti-free market. And we also see then throughout their writings the allegation that environmentalists are actually socialists in disguise. They often refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. I have to confess that green actually isn't my favorite color, and I have a lot of green things in my wardrobe, and I sometimes feel like I shouldn't wear green when I give these talks, but I decided that I would say in honor of David Suzuki and others here today. But I just want to point out that I'm actually blue on the inside because I'm so depressed about this issue. George Will, who writes for the Washington Post, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots, and my favorite, Senator James Inhofe, the U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, who has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress, has accused me personally of being part of the left-wing conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I respond that the left should be so organized. Again, Fred Singer is probably the most articulate advocate of this position. So in 1989, when he was attacking the scientific evidence of the ozone hole, he wrote, "And then there are probably those with hidden agendas of their own." Actually, I should point out to him that the plural of agenda is agenda, but in any event, not just to save the environment, but to change our economic system. So there's the anxiety about socialism. Some of these coercive utopians are socialists. Some are technology-hating Luddites. Most have a great desire to regulate on a large scale as possible. A couple of years later, he returned to the same theme, writing, "More dangerous still," sorry, I can't read this from this angle over here, "more dangerous still are those who have a hidden political agenda, most often oriented against business, the free market, and the capitalistic system." Of course, after the collapse of socialism, it is no longer fashionable to argue for state ownership of industrial concerns. The alternative is to control private firms by regulating every step of the manufacturing process. And again, notice this is in 1991. So this is before the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, this anxiety already emerging about the idea of global government control. So what we see in all of this, what we see as a consistent aspect in all of these arguments, is that this is not about the science. These debates were never about the science, the scientific evidence, the strength of the models, the robustness of the peer review process. Rather, what this was always about was about governance, and more specifically about regulation, about the appropriate role of government in protecting us from dangers. And it was driven not by a principled epistemic concern about the quality of science, but by an ideological commitment to laissez-faire economics, a belief in the inextricable link between political and economic freedom, and a hostility to regulation as a form of creeping communism, a hostility that was born and nurtured and hardened in the Cold War. Now, there are many ironies in the story, but I guess my favorite irony is about this claim that environmentalism is a green tree with red roots, because it's simply false. We know a lot about the history of the environmental movement in the United States. There's been a lot of academic and scholarly research done on this question. The roots of environmentalism in the United States are not to be found in left-wing politics. They have nothing to do with the international workers of the world, or the liberal or left-wing labor movements of the 1900s, 10s, and 20s, but rather the origins of American